In this lesson, we'll be talking about one of the more ancillary question tasks you can encounter for reading comprehension in the verbal reasoning section of the Gmat Focus Edition, and that's going to be application tasks. So, first off, as I mentioned, application tasks are probably the most rare. There's likely going to be one application task maximum per passage, and they are often considered harder tasks that involve matching information from the passage to one specific choice. And they can actually be critical reasoning argumentation style questions in reading comprehension, where they ask you to basically strengthen, weaken, explain, find a flaw, find an assumption for some sort of argument or argument like structure within the passage. And they are also possible data insights, two-part analysis, or multi-source reasoning tasks as well. So strategically, you need to carefully note the subject and limit your consideration of the task to that subject matter. Do not apply everything from the passage necessarily to the task, but just focus on whatever subject is being considered by the question. You'll want to summarize that subject as your functional prediction. You're not going to be able to predict specifically necessarily what's going to match the circumstance, but you're just going to summarize what it said about that subject and then go to the answer choices. You'll often be able to recognize an application task from the phrase of the following, as in which of the following does something. You can apply your critical reasoning argumentation processes from our other verbal reasoning lessons as needed, because sometimes you'll be asked to strengthen an argument or weaken an argument that's presented in the passage as one of these application tasks. And application tasks are going to be the most reasonable reading comprehension task to guess, skip, and mark if you're behind in pace. Remember that in the GMAT focus, you can return to a question potentially, but recognize that it can be a little bit difficult to come back to a passage after you've read other passages. But this question task is kind of self-contained. So if you are falling behind in your pacing, you can skip this task and this task really only in the reading comprehension passage. And your application question is ultimately going to ask which of the answer choice matches whatever the subject is. So we have a sample reading comprehension passage and a sample application task. And as is the case with every task, we're going to try and get this out of the weird phrasing of the GMAT. So, in which of the following environments would the impact of fresh water be most similar to that of fresh water on Anacapa Island? So, we're going to rephrase this, and we can do so by really simplifying this to just what matches the impact of fresh water on Anacapa Island. So we've got a specific term to look for. So we'd scan and we'd find the first instance of fresh water here on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're going to have to read at least a sentence above and a sentence below to get enough of our surrounding context. So given its rugged coastline and dearth of safe boat landings, ancient foraging on Anacapa Island must have been relatively challenging. Today, fresh water is found only in an isolated spring with no perennial running water on any of the island segments. As a result, vegetation is currently dominated by coastal bluff scrub and coastal sage scrub, with trees and shrubs limited primarily to two protected gullies on the northern slope of West Anacapa and at Shepherd's Landing on Middle Anacapa. So basically, we just need to find something that matches this information saying that there's no perennial running water, and we've got limited vegetation based on that because that's the fresh water circumstance on Anacapa Island. So if we look at our first answer choice, we've got a peninsula with several perennially active waterfalls. Well, several and perennially active waterfalls means there's more fresh water than there is on Anacapa, so we can eliminate choice A. Choice B, a heavily forested island with a centrally located lake. Well, the centrally located lake is probably too big, and furthermore, we could even look at the heavily forested and go, well, that's going to be more types of vegetation potentially, so that gets rid of choice B. We know that there was a limited amount of trees on Anacapa. Now, choice C, a desert oasis with a single well and limited immediate vegetation. Well, this actually matches, but it's based on the concept of what the fresh water is doing as opposed to just going, oh, I've got to match an island to an island. Otherwise, you might have chosen choice B, When choice C, that single well and limited immediate vegetation, really matches what's happening with the freshwater on Anacapa quite nicely. Then, once you've got a good check mark, you could potentially move a little bit more quickly. A freshwater marsh at the bottom of a mountainous canyon, well, the freshwater marsh is going to have way too much water. And then choice E, a tropical rainforest with continually falling precipitation. That's way too much water as compared to Anacapa, which has a very limited supply. And we'd happily choose choice C, understanding that we weren't going to come up with a desert oasis on our own, but we would be able to potentially say, okay, fresh water is limited, there's limited vegetation, and we just had to find an answer choice that matched that circumstance. So we've got one more example here on the right-hand side, same passage. And this time we've got which of the following, if true, would most help to explain the presence of large nesting bird colonies on Anacapa Island. So here our task is very similar to what you would find with critical reasoning. We're being asked to explain the presence of large nesting bird colonies. So we have to find that specific phrase, and we do at the end of the passage. Now, I'd probably read at least a sentence above to get context, but we see the steep slopes of the island likely made it difficult for people to bring marine resources to sites on the top of the island, although access may have been easier in the past. Anacapa Island hosts enormous colonies of nesting birds, especially western gulls and brown pelicans, the latter of which use Anacapa and Santa Barbara Islands as a primary nesting area along the west coast of the United States. So we need to explain why Anacapa can be a large nesting colony. Now, choice A, we've got sea lions and harbor seals are primary predators of brown pelicans. Now, this is why an application task and a critical reasoning style application task can be particularly difficult, because you may be thinking to yourself, well, that wasn't mentioned at all here. That's not good enough. It might have been mentioned somewhere else in the passage, which is why this gets difficult. I will have to scan for the phrase sea lions or harbor seals, and in the middle of the passage we see California sea lions and harbor seals are commonly seen in the waters and rocks around the island, but the absence of extensive beaches except at Frenchie's Cove on West Anacapa limits the area for pinnipeds to haul out. So that means that the sea lions and harbor seals cannot get to Anacapa in a lot of places. And if sea lions and harbor seals are primary predators of brown pelicans, which are one of the nesting birds that are cited, well, that would explain why, or help to explain why the brown pelicans in particular are able to host or are able to have large colonies of nesting birds because they're safe from one of their primary predators. So choice A actually is going to help explain the presence. And sometimes you have to go find those terms because you ultimately have what ends up being almost a supersized critical reasoning prompt for these types of questions. Now, choice B, kelp forests are prevalent on the coasts of many California islands. Well, that many is something that we can eliminate relatively quickly because that shows that Anacapa might not be unique. And that's actually going to not necessarily explain the presence because it doesn't show some sort of specific reason that Anacapa in particular is a safe place for these large colonies of nesting birds. So we can eliminate choice B. Choice C, we've got a delightful some ancient cultures. That could not be more vague if it tried, and we know that vague answer choices are great reasons to eliminate for argumentation style tasks, whether they're critical reasoning or reading comprehension in this case. Choice D, steep slopes can provide nesting. Well, again, we know we were talking about steep slopes, but that's can means possible. And the migratory birds, we're not talking about migratory birds necessarily. We don't know if western gulls are migratory. We don't know if brown pelicans are migratory from the information in the passage. That will require additional information, so we can eliminate choice D. And then most pelicans and gulls are known to be carnivorous. Well, this just introduces an entirely new variable that we need additional information to parse. So that allows us to select choice A, understanding that you may have to go find that specific information for something that may have seemed irrelevant at the outset. So, our process for managing these application tasks: recognize the key phrase of the following or just a standard critical reasoning argumentation task word, but recognize as well that if you can categorize a question that has the stem using the phrase of the following as either detail, purpose, or inference, you should categorize it as one of those three more commonly used tasks. The of the following and not being able to be categorized as detail, purpose, or inference is really what indicates an application task. Now, step two, as always, you want to read what is needed to address the question, subject, and task. For most application tasks, there is going to be a specific subject, and you'll have to read at least one sentence above and below to guarantee enough context, and you may have to read a little bit more for the answer choices, in particular with the critical reasoning questions, because it may have been somewhere else the information that truly is able to relate it to whatever argument was being presented or circumstance that was being presented. Step three is going to be to broadly predict what the answer should do by just summarizing what the passage said about that subject. In this case, it was the nesting birds, but also recognize that you might be able to broadly predict, as is the case with our argument tasks, what must be to strengthen or weaken or, in this case, explain the circumstance that was presented. And then step four, of course, is going to be to process of eliminate. Focus on what matches the information in the passage to identify objective reasons that the choices are wrong for our standard application tasks, things that are reversals of the information, things that are extreme based in the information, or require potentially common outside information. And for argumentation style critical reasoning application tasks and reading comprehension, you want to use our common argument incorrect answers as needed as well. Things that do the reversal of the task, so weaken when you wanted to strengthen, things that were vague, like we saw in that example moments ago, things that need additional information, as we saw in that example a moment ago, and things that truly have no impact, whether true or false, on the argument. So let's move on over to the whiteboard and take a look at how we'll utilize our scratch pad to work through these rarer, but sometimes the path to 700 plus on the Gmat focus, the application tasks in reading comprehension. So as always, we'll set up our scratch work first. We got A, B, C, D, E. We put a little line over top for the question task, and we see which of the following, if true, would most undermine the author's conclusion regarding the success of the South Texas Mariachi Festival. So this is basically looking to weaken that conclusion, and we need to find specifically the success of the South Texas Mariachi Festival. And if this were, and most likely an application task is going to be later on in the set of 3 or 4 questions for a critical or a reading comprehension passage in the verbal reasoning section. But for the purposes of this example, we can see that the success is right here. So we could pick up at the beginning of the paragraph and just read a sentence below, and we learn the success of the South Texas Mariachi Festival was made of several ingredients: unequivocal community support generated through a pre-existing school program, no frills budgeting, and the total commitment of the organizer. These same components are typically found in many of the mariachi festivals and conferences that have been held throughout the Southwest in the past 20 years. Okay, so we want to weaken. So our predicted weaken is find info to show basically something else. You can spell else. Led to the STMF success besides what was listed. And I can just shorthand STMF for South Texas Mariachi Festival. And so we go to the answer choices and we find many South Texas towns, including Driscoll and Corpus Christi, are known to have dynamic mariachi music communities. So we know that we were talking about Driscoll and Corpus Christi, and just like we did before, we have to go look for these terms. And we see that the South Texas Festival was from Driscoll, and we talk about Corpus Christi as being a place where they got professional groups. But it also said that there were a lot of these festivals throughout the Southwest, so that many of them have dynamic mariachi communities, if anything, actually seems to strengthen the argument. So we call that a reversal of the task, and we can eliminate choice A. Then choice B, a single benefactor regularly donated thousands of dollars to John Vella without dictating how the funds were to be allocated. Okay, so we know that Vella had been working with a budget of only $4,000. But if somebody else was donating a bunch of money and we know that the budget grew to $10,000, well, then these other ingredients aren't as key. It's actually this single benefactor. So this weakens the argument directly by providing a new reason for the South Texas Mariachi Festival's success. Now, choice C, the success of the South Texas Mariachi Festival has inspired similar events beyond the American Southwest. That is after the fact, so that has no impact either way. As we look at choice D, there's no record of mariachi education being conducted at the junior high level in Texas before the 1990s. Okay, no record. I know that John Vella started in 1991 at the very top, but this has no clear impact either way, whether there was a record or not a record. And then historically, mariachi has been a more popular art form in California than it has been in Texas. Well, I see that Vela was able to bring people from California to Texas, but just that it was more popular in California than in Texas has nothing to do with the argument about the success coming from several ingredients. And our correct answer would be B. And you see, this follows our critical reasoning structure very closely, but you just have to go and check those specific terms as they arise in the choices to make sure that nothing was buried in the passage, which again is part of why these application task questions can be a little bit difficult. Now, let's move on down on the board and we'll take a look at one more example of these application tasks. And this time, we set up our scratch work. We got A, B, C, D, E, and we got a little fill in the blank, which can always be a format that the exam uses in the verbal reasoning section in a lot of different ways. So, an event that would most likely have a mission similar to that of the first mariachi festival held by John Vella in Driscoll, Texas, is a blank. So, we can make this into a much smoother what matches style question. So, what matches the mission of JV First M Festival in DT for Driscoll, Texas? So, I just need to figure out what the original mission was for the very first mariachi festival. So I start reading at the beginning until we can come up with a prediction because we see teaching mariachi up there. So in 1991, a dedicated junior high high school music teacher named John Vella organized a mariachi festival in the South Texas town of Driscoll. Vella had been teaching mariachi music in public schools since 1980 and wanted to provide an intensive learning experience for his students. Oh, so what matches the mission? Well, the mission was to provide an intensive learning experience for the junior high music students. So we now have our prediction of what the mission was for the original. So choice A, paid concert featuring Latin music superstars. Well, that sounds fun, but there's no learning, basically, because we know it has to be about the learning. A small fundraising performance of high school band members. Well, again, there's no learning here either. A free dance intended as an ice-breaking event within a gated community. Okay, where's the learning there? A car show in which novice mechanics team with experienced ones to fine-tune custom hot rods. Oh, well, novice mechanics would therefore be learning from the experienced ones. And the key here is recognizing that the event doesn't even have to be a musical one. But choice D definitely has learning. And that's the most important thing with the mission of John Vella's first mariachi festival. And then traveling mariachi tour, moving from one city to another without much local interaction. Well, again, there's no learning. And even though choice D is the only one that really has nothing to do with music, it's our right answer because it has the same mission of teaching students with the experienced people through the event itself. So, this is probably the most difficult task for reading comprehension. Go ahead and practice some of these problems on your own so you can improve your performance at the higher end difficulty style questions that you'll encounter in the verbal reasoning section of the Gmat Focus.